Let's get right to MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde. Michael Weiss is with us, editor of The Insider, and foreign policy expert Hagar Chemali. She's also the former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN. So, David, the next step likely is for a special envoy and Jared Kushner to brief the president or his administration, right? What do we know about what came of these talks at this point?
We know very little. The announcement that the talks had finished actually came from the Iranian government officials. There are no reporters traveling with Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff, so we don't know what was discussed. That's unusual. If Marco Rubio were there, you'd expect there to be some American reporters. So we don't know. And this is a critical meeting. I mean, there's concerns in Washington that the president is sort of eager to carry out strikes on Iran. He wanted to do it before. There weren't enough forces in the region. And so there needs to be another round, I think, for any serious progress to occur here.
And just before these talks this week, Michael, we've been talking about this drone that was shot down as it approached a U.S. aircraft carrier in the region. And then President Trump made these comments saying that the supreme leader in Iran should be very worried. What kind of backdrop did that set for these talks today? Was it intentional to be extra provocative from each side?
I think so. I mean, he likes to sort of play this sort of dramatic game, will I or won't I, right? And there is a prevailing sort of school of thought that using the media to kind of speculate about his intentions and to kind of have these diplomatic tracks going in the background is a good distraction for him to actually get down to whatever kinetic operation he's planning. You know, the Iranians, too, seem to be aware that it's likely that something militarily is going to take place, and that's why they're kind of playing their own games. Originally, these talks were going to take place in Turkey. They said, no, we don't want to do that. Let's do Amman.
Now, why does that matter so much?
For them, it's the optics, right? They want to be on what they consider to be neutral ground, and Turkey would be seen as it's a NATO ally. Obviously, the Turks don't want to see the United States go to war with Iran, nor do any of the Gulf states, for that matter. That's been a big concerted push that I think they're leaning on Witkoff in particular, the Qataris, which have a very good relationship with Steve Witkoff. Please don't do this. Let's have a diplomatic solution. But I think the Iranians kind of see the writing on the wall. You know, one thing about Donald Trump, this is a guy who campaigned and decided to be the president who was going to be the anti-Obama, right? And we all remember the red line in Syria. Trump has this preternatural fear of looking weak or kind of submissive in any way. So I think the threat of a military campaign almost has its own momentum now, right? And he may not want to do it himself, but I think the overriding impetus here, and the Israelis are certainly putting pressure on him, you should do it.
Well, and he has done it. This administration has already gone after Iran and its nuclear sites specifically. But Hagar, all of kind of the latest action was sparked after the protesters were being killed inside Iran. And that is not at the core of today's talks. In fact, that was reportedly left off the table for these talks to happen. What message does that send to the regime and the Iranian people?
Sure. In my opinion, it's an awful message to send because it basically says that no matter what the Iranian regime does, there could always still be the opportunity for some kind of talks, or that this regime is still on the level of one that could be negotiated with because of its ostensible nuclear program. The fact is that we already struck their nuclear program quite heavily. The fact that these talks would focus only on the nuclear program, first of all, by the way, strategically makes no sense. Not only because we obliterated most of it, but also because ballistic missiles would be the real concern here at this point in time. The Iranian regime, while we don't want them to get a nuclear weapon, they're not close to that at this stage. And that said, again, if they are massacring their people in the thousands, and then that is what initiated Trump's response for potential military action, but then the message is, oh, we're going to negotiate, let's talk about your nuclear program. It also stabs the Iranian people in the back, and it makes the Iranian regime feel, again, that they can do whatever they want. They can massacre and torture and kill their people. Ultimately, the nuclear power is what gives them that seat at the table. It is the wrong message.
I mean, to your point, how much is a loaf of bread in Tehran? Because are these talks doing anything to change the situation for the Iranian people?
No, it's not. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned the price of the loaf of bread, because this regime is going to fall at some point soon. If it is not because of military action, it is because it doesn't have an economic leg to stand on. They had one massive bank implode. There are about 5 more that are about to implode. The currency has skyrocketed. Inflation has skyrocketed. And that is what sent people to the streets, because they cannot feed their families. And so there is literally no deal at this point that could get them to the point where they're going to be able to pay their IRGC soldiers. And that is what's going to crumble this regime. So when the Gulf leaders talk about, we know we're afraid of war. Yes, the Gulf likes that the Gulf remains stable, but they're also concerned that strikes could lead to a regime fall without another plan, or, creating another quagmire in Iran. The fact is that this regime is literally not going to stand. And that's what the conversation has to be about.
David, is the U.S. in the driver's seat here? Just how weakened is the regime after that so-called 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and, of course, after these massive protests?
I think that in the short term, the U.S. is in the driver's seat in that there's this threat of airstrikes. But talking to members of Congress and other experts, the U.S. doesn't have enough air power there to somehow take out the entire regime. The Israeli forces killed 50 top leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard last summer, and still the regime was strong enough to kill nearly 6,000 or 7,000 protesters. So the sense is, will these be strikes for show? It's just a very different situation. The concern is that President Trump, after the success of the Maduro raid, sees using the military as sort of a silver bullet. But Iran is very different. This is existential for this regime. And the biggest thing would be to support protesters, to get more Starlink systems in there so they can communicate with each other, communicate with the world, and build up that opposition, that grassroots opposition. That's the long-term strategy that other people are calling for.
And that has nothing to do with military action. Michael, one of the demands we've heard from the Trump administration is trying to convince Iran to turn over its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, maybe to a third country. Does that really protect U.S. assets, or anyone else for that matter, more than the current situation, given when you have countries like Russia being like, sure, we'll take care of it?
Right. Well, no, Iran is trying to isolate the nuclear file from everything else. The demands that the Trump administration putting no long-range or mid-range ballistic missiles. New York Times had a big story today that Iran has started to rebuild and refurbish some of the stuff that got destroyed in the 12-day war, but by no means have they gone all in on that yet. So they're trying to decouple all of the things that make this existential for them and go back to basically where we were in 2008. Like, let's have a conversation about our nuclear program. But look, I think with Trump, this is not a president who wants to do occupation a la Iraq. I mean, you mentioned Venezuela, right? What did we do? We snatched Maduro, and then we cut a deal with the regime. Maduroism without Maduro. The problem in Iran is, who are you going to deal with if you were to, say, assassinate the supreme leader? You would have to make a deal with members of the IRGC, and I've seen no evidence, maybe you have. None of them are really amenable to talking to the United States or doing business in this way. So I think this is the kind of dilemma that Trump finds himself. He can do something, a big smash campaign and, shock and awe and then declare victory. But at the end of the day, the protesters are still being arrested and killed. The regime is still in place, and you kind of reset to the status quo ante.
I also find it fascinating who all is involved in these talks. Hagar, once again, it is Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff handling negotiations for the U.S., the same people who are involved in Russia and Ukraine negotiations. Why these two? Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know if it's up to me to say whether or not it makes sense, but I will say that the president has clearly come to rely on the two of them for deal making. They clearly had success on the Israel-Gaza war, on Russia-Ukraine, much less so. And so, he's come to rely on them. And I think, I do think that there's sometimes value in having business folks or folks who come to negotiations with a different perspective. But I do believe, frankly, with the Middle East and with the Iranian regime in particular, if you don't understand this regime deeply and its history and its fundamental goals, it will never change its foreign policy or its objectives. That would be antithetical to this regime and how it came to power, and the fact that it believes in fighting the West and that Islam is the way to do it. And that is literally the core ethos of this regime. It cannot not build ballistic missiles and a nuclear program. It cannot not support terrorism across the world. And it cannot not torture and repress its own people, and by the way, export that repression around the world without that is how it stays in power. And so that said, I don't want to be overly unfair as well. in these talks, while the optics for the Iranian regime, I think, are not, they're not helpful for those of us against the regime. At the same time, it's the U.S. that is not jumping into this with rosy-eyed. From everyone I talk to, the U.S. it's very uncertain that the U.S. will get to a deal. The administration would like to see this regime go ultimately, but they don't want to own this and to have it create a bigger problem. As Michael said, with the IRGC, it's 300,000 strong, and they certainly would be much more harder, much more difficult to talk to, much more repressive. But that said, like I said, this regime is going to fall. It has no money. It's about to get even worse. And that's why people need to accept that reality and focus on, well, how could we fix this rather than get to a situation where it implodes and we have no influence on the inside?